And I think, you know, what you just said about this really shows a certain state of mind. And then we get into bands that took the bull by the horns by advancing the do-it-yourself approach and enterprise on the Irish music scene. And there seems to have been some, what I call the Malcolm McLaren touch or tactics behind Horslips. And yeah, so I think you talk about Horslips, a major Irish band. I don't know if people remember Horslips, but I mean, major Irish export at the time. Not a band who we would associate from the outside to the DIY approach, but I think of all the bands that you've described, they certainly seem to be an incredible band for applying these methods and by necessity. But maybe, you know, the whole thing started with a gig cancellation. So I think that's kind of, you know, they were from the get-go aware of the relationship between the band and the media, the image that they had. So maybe I'd like you to explore that phenomenon.
Yeah, Horslips, you know, clearly one of the most important bands in Irish music history, without doubt. But I think people haven't really acknowledged how important they are in the enterprise of music. They were incredibly savvy. They were, you know, I love that you mentioned Malcolm McLaren in that context of Horslips, because it was that situational approach that, okay, we could go and record great music, but how do you get attention for great music? You know, that's the eternal struggle. And they thought, well, we'll use all of the smarts that we have. So their records looked fantastic. And the show band records didn't. The artwork on the show band records, it it was primitive at best. Now, some of the Irish labels like Gaelin, they had fabulous, really sophisticated artwork, but Irish popular music didn't generally come beautifully packaged. It came loaded with gimmicks. And Horslips to the conservatives would have looked like a gimmick. To the people who love traditional Irish music, they would even have looked a bit dangerous and unruly and even a little bit degenerate because they weren't playing Irish traditional music straightforward. They were making it rock. But the enterprise behind Horslips is actually just as interesting as their musical innovation. And they were able to tap into that sensibility. And maybe they were even able to push that conversation about, hang on, the 1960s was about freedom, allegedly. We had Woodstock, we had the hippies, we've Bob Dylan, we had the civil rights movement. So how come things in Ireland feel so conservative? They feel so static. They feel that the traditional power groups are still in control. And so I think quite brilliantly, Horslips thought, well, the way to get a bit of controversy is to look like local priests, think that we're a threat to young people, that
Yeah.
we're going to lead them astray. So, you know, but by our standards, it was very, very turned. But even putting a word like aphrodisiac on a poster, you know, at early 1970s, late 1960s, that Ireland hadn't that big countercultural shift that other countries had experienced. So Horslips were really, really innovative and really exciting at the time. And they absolutely proved that an Irish band, and famously U2 became the exemplar of this, but Horslips proved Irish band can stay at home if they're business savvy enough. They can stay at home and deliver fabulous music if they retain control. So they set up their own record label, Oates Records. They brought the Rolling Stones mobile recording studio over to a big Irish country house. Ireland was a very, very poor country in the 1970s compared to other European countries. So there were big houses available. They brought bales of stray, bales of hay into into that country house to help the sound. One of the people, interestingly, one of the people who's paying attention, who's got a front seat to development of Horslips, is Paul McGuinness, who then later goes on to manage U2. So I think Paul McGuinness saw what Horslips could do, and that was the example he followed with U2 to obviously huge success. But the huge brilliance of the DIY enterprise of Horslips, I think, hasn't been celebrated enough, and that could be a model that could be revisited now by someone who was savvy enough.
Yeah, I will talk about U2 just in 1 minute, but I think what you just talked about, in more generally speaking, I think for Irish bands who and I think a lot of Irish musicians are trained in the traditional mold, and every time a band tries to broaden that mold, there is a lot of criticism in Ireland. It's very difficult for Irish traditional musicians to do something else than to escape the tradition. So I'm thinking about somebody like Damien Dempsey, who really, is very inspired by Bob Marley. But it's, it would be really interesting to study his model of, because I think he also jars, and I think every traditional band, Irish traditional music band that has tried to break out of the mold has been quite successful, despite a lot of criticism, and they've had a battle on their hands. And I think Horslips maybe were the first ones that were pioneers in this domain.